do this project. It's a lot of people, and I might have even forgotten some people. So thank you to everybody who's helped me do this project. It's taken a long time, and it's taken a lot of help, and I definitely cannot take credit for everything. And some of the people who've helped me a lot with this project are in the room today. So I appreciate your help. All right. I also want to say that this is a bit of a work in progress in the sense that this isn't published, and it's actually not even written yet. So if you give me feedback or ideas or things that you hate about this research or like ideas, things I could do better, you have the potential to change something that's going to be in the paper. So feedback and thoughts are very welcome. All right. So I want to zoom back to the early days of when Thomas started studying psychology. So I was an undergrad at the University of Michigan, and around 2006, I was starting out doing psychology research, and I was sent on a project to do research in China. So this is a picture of me from that research project that I was doing in China. And as a young researcher, I was fortunate because I happened to be interested in culture, and I was at the University of Michigan. And a lot of the cultural research that has been done in social psychology has been done at the University of Michigan. And I was fortunate to be there because people let me know secrets from the field. Like they let me know things that people at many other good universities didn't have access to because the people around them, culture is still a fairly rare field to study. One of the secrets that people let me know early on that was really helpful for my career was sort of an open secret. It's the idea that self-report scales don't work. So when I was young at the University of Michigan, people like Shinobu Kitayama, people who worked with like Richard Nesbitt, told me, by the way, when you're doing cultural research, don't use self-report scales because we know they don't work. Right? And if you look at a lot of my work, especially a lot of my early work, you'll notice that I don't use self-report scales to measure things like interdependence or collectivism or anything like that. And that's because people told me this secret from the field early on. I call it a bit of an open secret because you can see published papers demonstrating this. But I think it's still a secret because it's not, a lot of people don't know this. I don't think it's particularly widely known. Now, you might ask yourself, what does it mean to not work? Like, how does the scale not work? There have been a few people who've tried to formally define what it means to work for a collectivism scale. Here's one by Kaiping Peng, who's at Tsinghua, who used to be at Michigan. What he did is he got graduate students, people who were studying Chinese studies at the University of Michigan, and he showed them, values that cultures might differ on. And he asked them which culture should score, higher or lower on these particular values. And people tend to agree. So they tend to think that like China should score higher on interdependence. The United States should score higher on valuing independence, things like that. So one way to do this is you can poll people who have sort of expertise or experience and get their expectations about cultural differences. Steve Heine at the University of British Columbia did the same thing. He surveyed, rather than grad students, he surveyed faculty members at the University of Pennsylvania and a few other schools. And again, asked them similar things, although this one was particular scale items. So like, here's an item on a scale. Which culture do you think should score higher or lower on this? And the main finding is that people tend to agree about these, and that people expect East Asia to be more collectivistic and the United States, Canada, Western Europe to be more individualistic. So these expectations should not be surprising really to anybody. The problem is that when you actually use the scales to measure those cultural differences, the data from the scales disagree with what experts and I think regular people expect to be the case. So in that same paper, Kaiping Peng tested people in the US, Singapore, and China on different values. I'll just pull out a few as sort of random examples. So one is how much you value independence. In study one, the US and China were basically identical. In study two, China scored higher on valuing independence than the United States, which seems wrong. They also asked people about loyalty, which you might think is higher in collectivistic cultures like China. Um, Unfortunately, according to the data, the US scored higher in study 1 and then significantly higher in study 2. So people look at results like this and go, something seems to be wrong, right? In Kai-Ping Peng's study, what he did is he just said, okay, let's take all the values that they tested. What percentage of the time were the results in the predicted direction versus the opposite direction? And it's basically a wash. Like about half the time it's in the predicted direction, half the time it's in the opposite direction. Shinobu Kitayama did a similar study. They asked people about interdependence using these self-report scales. So here's where the US, UK, and Germany score on interdependence. Here's Japan. Seems wrong. Also seems weird that the US is more interdependent than like Germany, for example. And then finally, there have been several meta-analyses on this topic where they just take all the studies that they can find, comparing East Asia and usually North America, and then they say, what's the overall finding from all these studies? What Steve Heine said in his meta-analysis of 76 studies was, it's basically like flipping a coin. Like whether you find that the US is more collectivistic or Japan is more collectivistic, you might as well flip a coin because the results are no different. So seems like a problem, right? And this is what people meant when they told me at Michigan that I shouldn't use these scales, because if I did, the results weren't going to make sense. So this led to, I think, a little bit of a crisis in the field to say, what do you do with this? Like, this is clearly a problem. We need to solve this problem. And one possibility that is worth considering is that maybe our microscopes are right. And when I say microscopes, I mean our tools, our measures. Maybe our microscopes are right. We're wrong, and East Asia really is this individualistic place, right? We're all just wrong. There's popular opinions, just totally wrong. I've never met anybody who agrees with this opinion. I've met people, and I'll talk about some exceptions to collectivism, but I've never met anybody who takes this idea like seriously on a very fundamental level. So basically, I've never seen this attitude expressed. So instead, what people did in the field, I think, is blame the microscope. They said, the problem is in our microscopes, and we need to fix our microscopes. So when we say microscope, I mean something like self-report methodology. Like asking people to rate themselves is somehow fundamentally flawed, and we need to fix it. That's the response in the field. So that's what people did. So people spent several years trying to say, okay, let's figure out why self-report can't be used to measure cultural differences. And there are several candidates in this field. So for example, there are papers on response styles across cultures. So like, oh, some cultures just agree with all the items, or some cultures only use the middle response options or the extreme response options. And there's decent evidence for this. I'm not going to argue that this is not the case. There are papers documenting that response styles exist and they're different across cultures. Kai-Ping Peng in his paper argued that the problem is that the items are too abstract. So if I ask you, do you value independence? The things that we're imagining could be very different in different cultures. And so he says we should use more concrete items rather than abstract items. Another idea out there is called the reference group effect. So Steve Heine, who I mentioned before, said that the problem is that people are comparing themselves to people in the same culture. And that is sort of messing up people's answers. So he ran a study asking people to rate their own interdependence. And like in most studies, there's no reference group. It doesn't say who should you compare yourself to. And so like in most studies, he ran this and he found that Canadians rated themselves as more interdependent than people in Japan. Then he ran another condition. He said, okay, now compare yourself to people in your own culture. So if I'm Canadian, then I say, compared to other Canadians, I am what? And so that was the instruction. The results are pretty similar, right? In other words, people seem to be thinking, well, Canadians are not very interdependent, but I'm a bit higher than that. So people raise their ratings. And in Japan, it's the opposite. People think, oh, Japanese people are super interdependent. I'm not that interdependent. So then they rate themselves lower. And then theoretically, you can fix this by asking people to compare themselves to people in another culture. So in a third condition, if you're in Canada, they say, compare yourself, compare yourself to people in Japan. And when people did that, then it changes the result and it kind of makes sense. So Steve Heine says, hey, I think it's the reference group. We need to make the reference group clear in our surveys. So that's another response to this. I want to argue that those are valid things, like those studies that I just showed you are valid and totally reasonable things to say. But I'm going to argue that there's another more fundamental problem going on. And one way to think about this problem is I presented this data that I'm about to show you in Nick Epley's lab. So Nick is a researcher at my school. And I was getting into the data and stuff, and he was like, wait, hold on, Thomas, hang on. How did researchers create these scales in the first place? Like what was the original method for creating these scales? And I said, well, I'm not sure I really know. I wasn't there in the room, but I imagine it was like how psychologists create most scales in life, which is we sit in a chair and we think about items, right? And we consult our mind to create items, right? The scale that I'm about to show you today was created similarly by me, sitting in a chair in my office. I think when the first psychologists probably developed a depression scale, for example, they probably sat in a chair and came up with items using their head. There are more sophisticated methods out there, and there's ways of refining scales, but I think a large number of scales start this way, just based on what's in our head. And what I'm going to argue is that the problem is that what was in our head in that time period, and even now, was wrong. And so the problem was not in our microscopes, but in our heads. That's where the problem lies. And that we can solve this problem of collectivism. We don't have to throw away self-report. We don't have to ask people about cultural stereotypes or any of these things. Instead, if we fix the problem that was in our head, then we can get the right result. So that's what I'm going to argue. So I'm going to argue that the problem is in our heads. What's that problem? So imagine we're back in the 80s and 90s and we're creating these original collectivism scales, and we're trying to measure, okay, what is collectivism? What do we think about when we think about collectivism? Well, one way to get an answer to this is you can just go to Google and do an image search. And so what images pop up in the internet and presumably our minds if you type in collectivism and then see what images come up? So I did that. I went to Google, typed in collectivism, and here are some of the images that came up. So here we have like a propaganda poster from China. Here's another like sort of large crowd here. Here's something from Star Trek. And this is, I guess this is a rally or something, a parade in North Korea is my guess on this. So these are images of collectivism in people's heads, I think. To put it a little bit more formally, I think our intuitions are a mix of two things. So one bucket in our head is something like warm, fuzzy collectivism. It's like utopian socialism. It's most of the pictures that I just showed you would fall into this category of utopian socialism. We all cooperate with each other, big groups, like we love each other, no competition, all that stuff, right? If you notice in several of those pictures, they talk about big groups of people, right? So you've got that parade in North Korea, or that mass of people standing in a square, or that Chinese propaganda poster, which had like a farmer, a laborer, and a soldier, people from different walks of life, but they're all on the same team, right? Even though they don't know each other personally, they're all on the same team. These big groups, other people in general, right? You'll notice that at least one of those posters had warm fuzzies in it. Like that Chinese propaganda poster had these really wide smiles and people who are really happy to be on that same team, right? So that's that warm fuzzy thing. And like I mentioned before, with this idea of like socialism, it's cooperation, it's sharing, it's we don't compete with each other, right? That's the warm fuzzy version. I think that part of the problem here, and the reason why we have these intuitions about the word collectivism, is that it's right there in the word itself. Collective sounds like a large group of people, right? it seems weird if you say like we have a collective of like me and my mom, right? That just like doesn't seem like a dyadic relationship like that doesn't seem to apply when you hear the word collectivism. It automatically brings to mind large groups of people, and so I'm going to argue that that word itself is going to be misleading. The more we use this word, the more it's going to mislead us to think about these large groups. And instead, I created a word. It's a lovely word. It will just roll off the tongue whenever you say it after this talk. And that word is responsibilism. I joke, it's hard to spell. Even I sometimes forget how to spell it. But I like it because it emphasizes what I think collectivism really is. At first, it has this idea of responsibilities to other people, tight ties. And second, if it has this idea of tight ties in it, how can you have tight ties with everybody in the world, right? Or 1,000 people in a stadium? It just doesn't seem to make sense to be super responsible for everybody in the world, right? And so I think this word is going to give us automatically better intuitions about what collectivism really is. So if I can put responsibilism over here on the right side, it's about tight known others. It's not about everybody in the world. It's not about others. It's about people that you know and that you trust. Warm fuzzies are not required for this. You don't have to love people. You don't have to smile. You don't have to call them on the phone and tell them that you miss them. Warm fuzzies are not required for this. Instead, it's about roles, relationships, and duties to those people, right? How you behave with somebody requires you knowing what role or relationship you are to that person. How I treat somebody depends on whether they're a stranger or if they're my mom, or if they're a colleague that I don't know versus my best friend from high school, right? That's important. And finally, competition is okay. Responsibilism, I think, doesn't really have an attitude on competition. It's not relevant, I think, to collectivism. So if you go back and look at those original scales done in the 90s, if you look at the items, you'll see that they mix those two intuitions. Some of them fall in the first bucket, and some of them fall in the second bucket. And so those scales, I think, are a mix of those two intuitions. So if you look at those early scales, this is one of the most popular, widely used scales out there, created by Singlis and several colleagues. If you look at those items, here's one. I feel good when I cooperate with others. Love this item because it's so wrong, right? Like this is such a bad item, right? Why is it bad? Because one is I feel good. What do you even what? That's not collective. Collectivism doesn't care whether you feel good about something. That's an irrelevant thing, I'm argue. And then the people, who's the target of this? It's completely undefined, right? It's others. And if you think about what does the word others mean, like what does it bring to mind to participants? I think it's mostly strangers, right? Generalized other people, right? And so that's wrong, right? Like collectivism isn't about cooperating with everybody in the world. You need to know the relationship. Here's another one. The well-being of my coworkers is important to me. So here we have that warm fuzzy, right? Coworkers. Most people don't know all of their coworkers, right? In many modern companies and universities and stuff like that, we don't know all of our coworkers. So although that's defined here, I think it's not defined precisely enough. Some people emphasize winning. I'm not one of them. There's one of those like sharing and like I don't compete with other people, right? There's that idea. It's important to maintain harmony within my group, right? Here we have like want to get along with everybody, right? An interesting side point about the word group. The word group is actually quite difficult to translate into Chinese. You can translate it, and there is a translation. In fact, there are several valid translations of this. But the word itself is actually kind of abstract and a little bit weird in Chinese. If I have any Chinese speakers out there, it's often translated as 群体, which is like not a word that people use in everyday life. Which to me is, I mean, isn't that weird? If you had asked Thomas when he was 18 years old, where would it be easier to translate the word group, in English or in Chinese? I would have said, oh yeah, Chinese must have like it must be super easy to translate. And it's actually the opposite, right? Group is actually kind of a weird abstract word in Chinese. And I think that's telling. I think it's telling because oftentimes collectivism or responsibilism is not about large groups. The group is not the focus, oftentimes. Often it's specific other people, right? Or a specific, group of people, but not groups in this abstract way. That's a side point. We can think about that later. All right, so imagine you're a young idealistic researcher, maybe you're this young, and you're setting out in cultural psychology and you want to do a study, like graduate students that I talk to from different universities around the world, and you have an idea like, oh, I bet individualism is linked to analytic thought. Right? That's something that's sort of out there in the field. I'm going to test that idea. So what you could do is you could use a self-report scale and you could measure people's holistic or analytic thought. And I have some data on this. This is visitors to the website yourmorals.org. They took that collectivism scale that I showed you before, and they took a measure of cultural thought style. And so here on the x-axis, I have holistic pairing. So holistic thoughts more common in like East Asia. And then here I have individualism scores. So it's just the opposite of collectivism, right? Theoretically, what we should find is a decreasing relationship. So holistic thinkers should be less individualistic. Here's the actual data. Basically no relationship, right? I think this is another demonstration of these scales not working. But if you look at the individual scale items, you can break them down into those two groups that I mentioned before. We can look at the items that do correlate with people's holistic thought and the items that don't, in the wrong direction. So some of the items that don't work, if we look at those individual items, to me, pleasure is spending time with others, right? This one is in the wrong direction, and significantly so. In other words, it's Americans or it's analytic thinkers who are really agreeing with this item. My happiness depends very much on the happiness of those around me. Yeah, that one also doesn't work. It's important to maintain harmony within my group, doesn't work. Items that do work, though, here's one. We should keep our aging parents with us at home. Perfect, right? Specific relationship, duty, responsibility, great. I would sacrifice an activity I enjoy very much if my family did not approve. That one also works. If a relative were in financial difficulty, I would help. That one also works. So what I'm going to argue, some people could accuse me of cherry picking the particular items. I'm going to argue that that's not what's going on, that it's for a meaningful reason that some of the items do work and some of the items don't work. Now, I want to clarify, I'm not the first person to say what I'm saying today. I picture myself less as a sort of Luke Skywalker rebel person who's, defeating, the system, and really more like the American fable of Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed, for non-Americans, is just, he didn't invent the apple. He just spent a lot of time bringing apples to different regions, right? So really more of sort of trying to popularize this idea that's already out there. Many people have said it better than I have. The famous rapper Notorious B.I.G., in one of his songs, he says, when I was young, I was just thinking like everybody got along with everybody and everybody's just loving everybody. It's not like that. Associates and friends are two completely different things. That's responsibilism right there. So I'm not the first person to say this. Okay? Triandis has similar ideas in his book Individualism, Collectivism. If you look at like Susan Cross work about relational self-construal, I think some of those items work. Brewer and Gardner talk about collective versus relational. So collective is like large groups and relational is more about like specific relationships. So these ideas are sort of out there, right? You might ask yourself, why even talk about this if these ideas are kind of out there already? One is because people are still using these scales. I cannot stress to you enough that these are by far the most commonly used scales of collectivism out there. I have colleagues in my department who come to me with data that they've collected in the last year that use these scales, and they're like, the results don't work. What's going on, right? This is not known. That crappy scale that I showed you before, 3,000 citations for that scale, right? And secondly, because Because this is such a fundamental intuition, like I think it's a problem with the word collectivism and associations with like socialism. Even if you tell people that utopian warm fuzzy just kind of creeps back into our minds over time. So people, even if they've learned it once, it kind of creeps back into their minds. So Triandis in his book says something like, collectivism isn't about loving everybody. And then like a year later, he writes this scale that has items about loving everybody, right? And so it's like on the one hand, seem to be aware of this and then creates that, commits that error later. So it seems to be a problem. Some evidence that people still hold this intuition. I surveyed published authors in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, about half from the West, about half non-West. So these are published cultural psychologists, right? Like these are experts in the field of cultural psychology. And I showed them items like the well-being of my coworkers is important to me. And I said, hey, we surveyed 100 people in China, 100 people in the US. Which do you think agreed with this item more? A lot of the people said, maybe because they know me, that was about equal. But the remaining people favored East Asia for that. Here's the actual data on that question. Not even close. Americans by far agree with that item more. And only 5% of cultural psychologists guessed correctly this direction. Here's another one. I feel good when I cooperate with others. Again, we got a lot of about equal, but everybody else kind of supports East Asia. Here's the actual data. Slight favor of the United States, not significant. 10% of people guessed this direction of the finding. But some of our intuitions do fit, right? So when I asked people, we should keep our aging parents with us at home, their guesses were exactly the same as the data. So 95% of cultural psychologists guessed this one correctly. So to me, that's evidence, not that all of our intuitions are wrong. The tight tie intuitions, those are right, but the warm fuzzies are wrong. And we have both in our heads. That's my argument. Finally, I think it would be useful to have a valid self-report scale that people could use. So hopefully if we supplant the bad with the good, hopefully we can correct this in the future. So what I propose is if we write a new scale measuring responsibilism and leaving out the warm fuzzy, those items will work. Right? So I created 27 questions. I followed Kaiping Peng's advice to define the situation rather than use these vague, abstract questions. Define the relationship, and then focus on responsibilities versus this generalized positivity. So in my scale, if you love everybody and don't care who that person is, you are less collectivistic, right? I'm defining generalized positivity as less collectivistic or less responsibilistic, okay? Here's an example item. So you're working in a company for 2 years, you meet a coworker from another department that you've never met before. They start asking about the sales account that you're working on these days. They want to know more about it. The item is, I would feel comfortable telling this coworker about the account. What I'm doing here is I'm defining the situation. So where are you? Who is this person? Do you know each other? And so on. I like this item in particular because you're at the same company. So if the group is sufficient, then people should like this person and be good to them. But in my mind, responsibilism, it's not sufficient to be in the same company or the same group or whatever. You need to actually know that person. And in this situation, that you don't know that person. So just to be clear, I would predict that people in the United States would agree with this item more, and people in like China or Kenya would agree with this item less, right? Because they don't know that person. Here's another one. So you live in an apartment with 4 roommates that you didn't know before you moved in. So that's an important part. One of the days your roommate says, hey, if I have several friends, can one of them sleep in your room because my room's not big enough? And the item is, I would happily agree. By the way, I asked that to the cultural psychologists. Most of them agreed that people in East Asia would agree with that item more. Here's the actual data. Americans agreed with that item more, right? So just more evidence of that warm fuzzy mistake. So I took that scale that I showed you with all those items, and I tested people in 100 cultures around the world. This was where I got a lot of help from many people, including some people in the room today, 18,000 people. What I will show you, I'll show you the data several ways. One way is to compare it to Kaiping-Peng's data. So I showed you before that for Kaiping-Peng's data, about half the items worked in the predicted direction, half in the wrong direction. What I can show you is like particular. So if I want to, compare my data to Kaiping-Peng's data, he tested people in China versus the University of Michigan. So I did something similar. When I did, 81% of the items, the new items that I created, worked in the sort of correct direction. You might think, is there some sort of language confound or translation? Hong Kong is a neat place to test for this because it's a place where you can use English, so you know that you're not, translating unfairly. So I compared that University of Michigan sample to people in Hong Kong in English, and similar findings there. So the majority of the items are working in the correct direction. Now I'm going to show you sort of more overall data, and I'm going to split the data up into Western countries like the US or the UK or Germany, non-Western countries like India, Kenya, Japan, and then I'm going to have a middle category of countries that are considered sometimes Western, sometimes not, like Mexico, Russia, Serbia, so Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean. So here are the differences between Western countries and non-Western countries. That's huge. This is a Cohen's d of 1, meaning that a full standard deviation difference between Western and non-Western countries. So this is not a coin flip. This is a difference that is reliable and detectable. And then if you look at those sometimes Western countries, again, like Mexico or Brazil, they fall sort of in the middle there, which I think makes sense. You might then ask yourself, like, well, maybe some of those other scales that already existed, maybe those worked too. Is this really different from those other scales? Here are the correlations between the responsibilism scale with many of the scales that are out there. You can see that, so I think only one of them is significant. Most of them are either basically 0 or in the wrong direction. None of them is suggesting that this is identical. The largest is 0.27, which is quite small. So it seems to be different from other scales that are out there. You then might ask yourself, how can we know whether this scale is real? Did Thomas just create something that taps into people's stereotypes? Or does this correspond to people's behaviors? One way to do this is to talk about holistic thought, which I showed you before. So I had some people take the triad task, which measures holistic thought, and then compared that to their responsibilism scores. It's not a large sample, it's not a strong effect, but it's there in the right direction, which is, it's good. It's like better than what we had before. Another thing that I did is I took those country scores and I compared them to an index that was created in the last couple of years called the Global Collectivism Index. This uses things like divorce rates, people living alone, and a couple world values survey items. And here's what we find. So responsibilism, Global Collectivism Index. They seem to be tapping into sort of a similar thing. Another thing I looked at was Joe Henrich's Kinship Intensity Index. This has to do with extended family living together, the presence of like lineages or clans, also cousin marriage. And what we find there is, again, responsibilism, and then higher on the Kinship Intensity Index. So that seems to make sense. I also looked at Alain Cohen's wallet return study. So they dropped wallets in different countries around the world and then tracked what percentage of those wallets were returned. Now, keep in mind that these are essentially strangers. Like an anonymous wallet that you find is essentially a stranger. So responsibilism should actually predict less returning the wallet of a stranger, right? And here's what we find, indeed what we find. So responsibilism, less likely to return that wallet. And I think the critical thing here is because it's a stranger. There was a fun study done on parking tickets at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. So New York City is, famously difficult place to park in, but because people are diplomats at the United Nations, they don't have to pay their parking tickets. So you don't have to pay anything. You can park wherever you want. You can get as many parking tickets as you want. You don't have to pay it because you're a diplomat. And so what ends up happening is some people take advantage of the system. And remember, this is a system. It's not a duty to a friend. This isn't your family. This is an abstract system, right? So what we find is that people in responsibilistic cultures are more likely to incur these parking tickets. That's also a log scale, by the way, if you look carefully. So that's a ton of parking tickets. Like if you look at, I think it's Kuwait, it has the most. That's log 5, which is an amazing amount of parking tickets. Kind of interesting when you think about it. Finally, even if you don't care, if you personally don't really care about national culture, I think responsibilism can help us understand things that are out there other than national culture. So, for example, you can look at regional differences. There's the idea that the northern United States is more individualistic than the southern United States. I have data from Michigan, Virginia, and South Carolina. And indeed, we find that the South scores more responsibilistic than the North, which makes sense. Italy has a famous North-South collectivism split. The South is like the mafia, the more collectivistic area. I don't have a ton of data from Italy. It's not significant, but it's trending in the direction where Northern Italy is less responsibilistic. So that's kind of fun. I've looked at rice wheat differences in China. So rice areas are more collectivistic than wheat areas. And indeed, that's what I find comparing people in China. This, by the way, also helps take care of issues of like if there's a translation or any sort of like translational issue, this should take care of it. Socioeconomic status is another thing that collectivism differs based on. And so I compared students at top research universities in the United States with students at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which has a lot of first-generation college students and students with immigrant parents as well. And what we find is that at top research schools, people are less responsibilistic. At the more socioeconomically diverse school, people are more responsibilistic. Finally, you can use this, I think, to understand political differences, at least in the United States. Researchers have argued whether conservatives are more collectivistic than liberals. If you look at people's arguments about this, you'll see things like, well, conservatives seem collectivistic, but what about welfare? Liberals support welfare, which seems collectivistic, so maybe there's no difference, which to me is exactly a misunderstanding of what collectivism is, right? Welfare is a system that supports people that you don't know. It is abstract, it is impersonal, and so it makes sense that liberals who are more individualistic should support this abstract system that doesn't depend on relationships, right? So if you use this lens of responsibilism, you can see, I think, that liberals should be more individualistic, conservatives more responsibilistic, and indeed that's what we find in the data. I find it, if you look at all the data in the world, or if you just look at the United States, I want to say, or if you just look at Western participants. And finally, I think this makes sense with one of my favorite findings ever from social psychology. Researchers asked people how much they identify with different groups of people. And so, for example, if you look at community, conservatives identify slightly more, country, conservatives more. But if you look at how much do you identify with the world, with everybody in the world, then it flips, right? So liberals identify with the world more than conservatives. Or if you ask people how much they have loving feelings towards different groups, both liberals and conservatives really love their romantic partners, perhaps not surprising. Conservatives report loving their family more than liberals. Liberals are slightly higher on friends there. But my favorite is when you ask people about generic others, right? So people in general, strangers, liberals report liking generic others more than conservatives. And if you compare the means, liberals are essentially saying, I like generic others more than I like my family. Now, in fairness, there's no item that says that directly, and I kind of, well, I'm not sure if it would work if you ask people directly, so I'm being a little bit unfair with the data. But that's also kind of hilarious, I think. It makes a lot of sense if you've spent time in liberal circles in the United States. So, all right, what I have covered or tried to cover today, one is I hope I've put forth the argument that it's possible to measure collectivism using self-report. We don't need to throw out self-report. It can be a reliable tool. Second, we need to be careful about the intuitions that are in our head. Our scales and our intuitions mix the warm fuzzy with the tight tie responsibilism. And I think responsibilism can be helpful for things outside of culture, like politics, regional differences, and social class. So I think this is a lens that is useful even outside of thinking about China and the United States, right? There are some enduring questions though. So one of them is, what about those warm fuzzy scales? Are those just completely nothing? Are those just a figment of our imagination? I think no. I mean, there are many studies that use those scales, and they find that they are correlated with even objective behaviors of people, right? I think the warm fuzzy is measuring something. It's just not the same thing that we're measuring or that we want to measure when we're measuring like collectivism in a place like Pakistan, right? These are just different ideas, right? So thanks for listening, and I thank you to all my collaborators, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions and what people have to say and talk more. And then I'll just put up a few topics that other topics that I didn't get to in my talk. And if you want to ask about any of those, I'd be happy to ask about those or to talk about those.